Thank you very much indeed, Sarah and Bryn, and all of you for joining this evening. Let me begin by repeating the apology that you've already heard from Sarah. I've been battling flu symptoms most of today, and defeat is looming up, I'm afraid, so I hope you'll pardon me if I bow out a bit early and leave you to discuss among yourselves. But I hope that in what I say there may be a few things that are worth pursuing a little bit further and filling out, because not being in any remote sense an economist or an expert in that area, I shall really be offering some fairly basic reflections on the ethics of our tax system, or the lack of them, and looking at where some of the deeper roots might be in changing how we feel, how we talk about this. Because, of course, as you've already been reminded, tax is very definitely an issue at the forefront of our national conversation at the moment, such as it is. One of the tragedies of the election campaign, as it's emerged so far, is the element of racing to the bottom that we see on all sides. That is, a desire to plug gaps, to produce brief sound bites, to address existing anxieties without any real reflection on whether they're well-founded anxieties or not. And tax and migration are, of course, among the two foremost areas where that is the case, where a climate of feverish anxiety has been created, and no one is actually digging to see what the first principles might be that would help us to construct a slightly more sane and sustainable way forward in both those areas, and indeed quite a few others. As I said, I'm not remotely an expert in this area, but for the last nearly 3 years, I've been the co-chair of the Independent Commission on the Constitutional Future of Wales. A bit of a mouthful, but it's been a body looking at the future of devolved government in Wales, the degree of independence in governance that Wales might look for, and very particularly looking at two kinds of issue. One is very simply, what are the questions that are most pressing on the street for the people of Wales? Where does the present devolution settlement work, and where doesn't it? And that, of course, takes us into all sorts of discussions about public services, and notably in our discussions over the last couple of years, to thinking about the transport system and the prison system, but more of that in other contexts. The second area that has really preoccupied us has been the question of what we're doing, or what we can do, about a more effective culture of political education in Wales. If we're thinking about the constitutional future of Wales, we have to think, we decided, about what kind of democratic culture we are creating. And so, unsurprisingly, in the context of this, we did have a number of seminars and deep dives and roundtables and so forth on issues to do with tax. There were certainly some weeks where I felt I now knew more about the Welsh tax regime than any sensible person would ever want to know. But among the issues arising there was, of course, the very fundamental question posed for a small nation like Wales. We don't have much of a tax base. We are bound to be connected with the UK system one way or another. Even those who are most adamantly in favour of independence recognise that there has to be some sort of transition. And one thing we argued for very strongly was that the UK-wide system of allotting resources to the non-English nations was long overdue for a very substantial overhauling. But behind that plea was something which I want to put front and centre really in our discussions this evening. Many on the Commission, and many of those we spoke to, said something like this: this Commission on Welsh devolution is not a way of dismantling the United Kingdom. It's a way of raising the question of why the United Kingdom is worthwhile for the smaller nations. And that in turn is a way of asking, why should the smaller nations, and especially somewhere like Wales, which has more than its share of economic privation, why should those other nations trust the government in Westminster? And what I want to say is that the issue of taxation is fundamentally an issue about the creation of a trustworthy society. A large proportion of our social ills, a large proportion of the collapse of community that we see in so many ways around us, has to do certainly with a drift, an indifference about the whole notion of public service and public good that certainly would keep us talking for at least the rest of this evening's session. But I would say it comes to the fore very particularly for those who feel that they have no stake in the society that they are told they are part of. They are expecting not to benefit, and they are expected not to contribute. And the challenge that we face in talking differently about tax is somehow turning that inside out and saying a really just participatory society, a stable and sustainable democracy, is a society where people are trusted to contribute and can trust that there is a safety net. Both of those, I think, are equally important. And I stress that because of the lazy rhetoric which says that tax is all about giving away my money to other people who haven't earned it. Think of it differently. Think of it in terms of what would make my neighbour trust me. Because that's the question, I think, that is in the minds of a great many people in the United Kingdom. People in the South Welsh valleys living with fourth-generation unemployment, people waiting for NHS appointments, people totally confused and alienated by the benefits system, and so forth. Certainly in the grassroots work we did with and for the Commission, that was one of the messages that came through most clearly. People experienced the benefits system and many other aspects of governance and government as something done to them. And in contrast to what, as I say, the lazy rhetoric sometimes says, the vast majority of people do not want to be done to. They want to be taken seriously as people who do, people who act and participate, who are able to have some control and some investment in how their society is run. And for that, they need security, they need hope, they need a trustworthy society. A couple of months ago, I was giving a talk to some students in the Philippines online, and at the very end had one of those curveball questions that people like to put in at the end of question periods, which is simply, so what one-sentence message would you give to our students, Professor Williams, about their priorities? And I thought rather hard, and I said, can I just say, act so as to create trust. Act so as to create trust. And keep thinking, what would a society look like in which action for the sake of creating trust was taken for granted as a sort of bottom line in our activity? And that's why I so welcome what Just Money is doing around the tax system, because it is quite rightly saying we need a major revolution in imagination here. We have a deeply entrenched mythology to counter. The mythology that tax, as I say, is about taking my money and giving it to someone else, rather than being a system whereby we recognize that the challenges we each one of us face are none of them challenges, that is, serious challenges, are none of them challenges which we as individuals or local communities or even national communities can effectively handle, plan for. In order to confront honestly the damage that threatens us, in order to handle it with responsibility and hopefulness, we need something more than a focus on our own resources and the security of our own individual or local resources. And if you think that is a matter of international concern as well as national, you would be quite right. And it's in the light of that, like many others, I so much deplored the government's reneging on its commitments about international aid a couple of years ago. We don't think of that in terms of a tax on Britain for the sake of the world. And yet somehow the enshrinement in statute of a duty to contribute some of our gross national product to a very needy and troubled world is part of creating a trustful international culture, which Lord knows is something we are not very evidently in possession of just at the moment. So that's where I'd want to start. The imaginative challenge is doing without that mythology, turning it around, thinking of what it means to recognize that the problems that most matter are problems that are everyone's business, if only in the sense that no one of us can resolve them alone. This is a message we're very used to hearing in the context of our environmental crisis. It's a message we hear, of course, in the context of the pandemic and all that goes with that. I think it would be interesting, it might even be fruitful, to see if we can transfer some of that language, that argument, into talking about tax. Not simply about money contributions, but about trust contributions, grounded in the recognition that the problems that are most serious are shared problems. In the spring of this year, I found myself giving 2 sets of lectures, one in the United States and one in Oxford, on the theme of solidarity as a political, social and moral ideal. Those of you familiar with Catholic social teaching will know that solidarity is one of the keystone ideas in the Catholic notion of what a just and sustainable society is. Pope John Paul II spoke of the essentials of a just society being dignity, subsidiarity, and solidarity. And you could pile up quotations from documents in the last 15 or 20 years, especially from the Vatican, which underline that point. And Pope John Paul said something very important back in 1989 about this, that solidarity is not just a feeling of compassion, what you might call an "oh, I know" feeling. Solidarity is the active investment of our energies in responding to the recognition that we share frailty, we share vulnerability. It's not even a matter of, oh, the strong should help the weak. It's a matter of the strong recognizing that simply as part of the human race, they share fragility, they share need. And the deepest form of solidarity we can understand is the idea that we all, in a sense, we are all hungry. And to borrow the phrase from the New Testament, hungry and thirsty for justice, not just for material food. And to be hungry and thirsty for justice is to be hungry and thirsty for that society where people act and participate, where, as I say, they are confident that they will be attended to, and they know that others are confident in them to play their part in society. Giving and receiving confidence is what, I would say, a healthy approach to taxation requires. And it requires that demythologizing I've spoken of, that easy and glib picture of tax systems as what other people do to us, rather than being intrinsically an aspect of democratic maturity, shared responsibility arising out of a recognition of shared vulnerability or shared frailty. I suppose that's why, going back to our Welsh Commission for a moment, that's why in our recommendations we wanted to underline very strongly that what we were recommending to the Welsh Government and the Westminster Government was not just a set of changes that might make things work a little better in the system as it existed. we were asking them to pursue the question of what educates a genuinely democratic culture. We had some very rewarding experiences with a couple of brilliantly creative youth groups in Wales, determined to pursue and develop the possibilities of proper democratic education for teenagers, very often for teenagers who were in various ways on the margins of things, and who certainly didn't often feel trusted or listened to. And I think that got into our bloodstream as a commission, rather. We said, whatever happens about the particulars of devolved government, let's at least see if the Welsh Government can be a bit of a pioneer in improving civic education in schools and in improving citizens' panels, consultative processes at every level, where we model the trust that I've just been talking about. We model that idea that people will flourish in a democracy when they know they can be confident in others and others can be confident in them. So that's a very abstract account of where I think we ought to be coming from ultimately in thinking about taxation. Fleshing that out, as I'm sure you'll want to do in discussion this evening, takes longer and needs a great many skills. It's certainly not the case, as I think most people, even on the far left, would recognize, it's not the case that we should imagine that every major social problem can be resolved by throwing state funding at it. Much more complicated than that. But to have a state in which it is assumed that fair distribution, a fair sharing of the load, is the norm, to have a state in which people are volunteering to ask themselves what is needed from me in order to make this a more trustful society, I'd like to see us pushing that as much as we can in this so far pretty dire election campaign. I'm not hearing much at the moment from either of the major parties about that fundamental question: what sort of society do we want to be? I'm hearing quite a lot about deck chairs on the Titanic. I'm hearing quite a lot about the fact that public funding will be so eroded by the time a new government comes in that the chances of radical change are very, very slender. I'm not hearing a great deal about why that should worry us and how we might do better. And of course, looking around the world, we're not all that brilliantly supplied with good examples of how to do it differently, are we? But that's no reason, I think, for not challenging mythology. And I talk in this way about mythology because, as many people have said, the biggest political changes come when something shifts in the imagination. People said it, didn't they, about the Brexit campaign. The imaginative energy was all on, showing my colours, all on the wrong side. And to say just vote no never somehow sounds like a terribly positive or exciting option. So there's that in the background. And I remember some very interesting books being written in the last 5-10 years, making that appeal, pointing out that it is imagination here that really shifts things. And I think, too, of a book published quite a few years ago by the late and great philosopher Mary Midgley, a passionately eloquent and sophisticated environmentalist, a book called The Myths We Live By. And that was an attempt by a serious philosopher to say, don't imagine that political philosophy, or indeed economics, works by rational argument. It works by mythology. And if you want to shift things, you've got to change the story. Now, to a very limited extent, we have just begun to change the story in a good many people's minds about the environment. Just begun to turn the ocean liner around, as they say. to get people to understand something about shared vulnerability there, something about the issue of intergenerational justice and the like. And what I'm saying is it's a parallel kind of challenge when we talk about the tax system. Turning it around to make it about what constitutes a trustworthy society is the task before us. It's not, as I say, to sideline or deny the significance of serious, detailed, demanding work on the granular economics of it. As I noted in our Welsh Commission, we couldn't get away from that and had our noses well and truly rubbed in it. And one of the most exciting things in the process was to see some think tanks from the Welsh nationalist background producing a set of extremely detailed and sophisticated essays on what kind of adjustments in our attitude to tax would be necessary if Wales were ever to think about independence. And also recognising in that literature, in a way that not many politicians do, recognising that independence might be a good which outweighed the short-term costs of losing a certain level of public comfort. And nobody wants to talk about that because nobody, it seems, is going to vote for it. But here we are, committed as we are, to a vision of social belonging together, a vision grounded in the reality, as we Christians would say, the reality of the body of Christ. And what we have to offer in this or in any society is that kind of radical, comprehensive vision of what it's like for human beings to live together healthily. And when we read in the New Testament about the body of Christ, we read that if one part of the body suffers, all suffer. And we read that faith, trust, is fundamental in our relations with one another as with God. And we read that the gifts that are given to any individual and to any local community are given very strictly so that they may be life-giving for others. The life that is given to us doesn't sit still in our hands. It is there like water pouring from a waterfall. We can cup our hands under it and direct the flow somewhere, but the water doesn't sit in our hands. It flows on. And that, I think, is something of the social vision that, as Christians, we consciously or unconsciously are drawing on. When we think about taxation, when we think about tax justice, not only in this country but globally, when we think about the issues around tax avoidance, tax evasion that we have wrestled with in recent years in a number of campaigns, and I speak here as a former chair of Christian Aid who was very much involved in tax justice campaigning in the last decade, all of that has its roots in that challenging notion that the recognition of shared fragility, recognition, therefore, that we need to be able to trust one another, that, odd as it may sound, that is what consolidates, secures us. Not the building of boundaries around ourselves, but the recognition of weaknesses that we share. Get hold of that as an ideal, and the world looks a bit different, begins to tilt a bit on its axis. How we do that, how we get this across, is very hard to work out. As I say, I expect you'll have lots more specific and more challenging ideas to put into this. But to repeat what I said early on, if we can connect that impetus with the vision that has begun to change minds just a bit about environmental and health issues, if we begin to link this up with the fundamental recognition that no global problem is just one person's or one community's problem, if we link it up with the idea that we all share the same challenges, and that, as I've so often said in recent years, crises don't read maps. If we get away from that rigid and wooden approach, which so paralyzes us internationally, we may be just taking a few steps on the road to a more sustainable democracy. So, to sum up, and with renewed apologies for taking myself off to bed with a cold compress, I think what I'm saying is the challenge is imagination. The challenge is about prioritizing of a trustworthy society. Priority is recognizing that when we confront the frailty we share as human beings, we actually break through to a confidence and sustainability that we need. I hope very much we can, as Christians, put something of that into the not particularly encouraging culture surrounding the election campaign. We know it's a long job, but that's no reason for giving up. I deeply applaud what's being done. I hope that all of you on this call tonight will be able to do what you can to help demythologize, to help shift that narrative, and open up once again that vital conversation about what a truly democratic culture looks like, in which no one is forgotten, and where people feel that they are trusted to act and to contribute as well as to receive. So there's a few thoughts for you to play with. Thank you for listening patiently.